Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Unsurprisingly, listeners, I'm very much drawn to the work of debut Australian authors, and this year I'm delighted to be interviewing a number of them, one of whom is my next guest. Kate Horan is a Sydney-based ex-English teacher who once taught at high schools in Western Sydney, loving being able to inspire teenagers with a love of reading. For the last 17 years, however, Kate has worked in corporate communications, helping executives pitch and present. But early last month, her debut novel was released by HQ Fiction. Called The Inheritance, Kate's story follows two women whose lives become inextricably entwined when they cross paths over a controversial property development in an exclusive historical enclave in the southern highlands of New South Wales. It's a story about wealth, about entitlement, corruption, and what we inherit from our parents. It was a gripping, sophisticated story by a truly talented writer, and I'm thrilled to welcome Kate to the podcast today. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure, and I simply loved this story. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's so wonderful for people to be reading it. It's so exciting. I mean, obviously, it's my first novel, so I've been writing away, with just these imaginary friends in my head. And it's just a fabulous experience now when I'm talking to people and they know my imaginary friends and their story. And yeah, it's fantastic.
Indeed. Kate, I wondered if you could tell me how long was this novel in the making? Was it your first novel or was it the latest in a line of practice novels?
So this was the second manuscript I wrote. The first manuscript is going to be my second book, which has just been accepted by my publisher. And so that's, on the way to the structural editing sort of phase as we speak. But I had the idea for this when I wasn't quite finished with that first manuscript. And it just to me felt the DNA kind of concept that the book explores, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. It felt like a bit of a zeitgeisty thing. And I felt quite keen to just crack on and write it. So that's what I did. I think that it probably, I would say 20 months, and that includes the writing and then the additional sort of phases of rewriting throughout the editing process. I would say it was probably 20 months from start to finish.
Yeah, fantastic. That's actually relatively quick in the scheme of things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always look at those writers that pump out a book a year and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So I don't know. It doesn't feel as quick as some, but yeah, not too bad.
Yeah. Now, I don't ask every author this, but I'm fascinated to understand different pathways to publication. You and I were talking a little bit about this before we started recording. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about yours.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, the kind of amazing thing about my pathway to publication is how fast it was when it actually did eventually happen. It can feel, I think, like things are never going to happen, but then you just never know what's around the corner. So this time last year, I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a publisher. I didn't have a book deal. I didn't have a book. So it was in April of 2024 that my agent signed me at Curtis Brown. And then at the very end of May, she sent it out on submission to all the different publishers. And she was going to be away for a few weeks. So she said, take your time to read it and come back to me. I think it was sort of mid to late June that she wanted people to revert with offers if they were keen. Well, HQ made an offer 3 days later. So it all happened extremely quickly. And not only did they make an offer, but they wanted to publish it in January. So between signing my book deal and the book coming out was 6.5 months, which is crazy. So it's interesting because publishing does move so slowly most of the time, but it doesn't have to. I think suddenly when they want it to move quickly, it definitely can.
That's a really fascinating story. And as I was saying to you earlier, I think it's a great story to tell because so often the story is about how long the publishing process is. And a lot of people, have had manuscripts out there for a very long time or been working for, 10 years or so and not having a lot of luck. So it is really lovely to hear a story that moved quite quickly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that bit did. I submitted it to a couple of agents in June of the previous year. So that bit went quite slowly. I submitted it to a few agents, and it wasn't until maybe 3 months later that Claire Foster at Curtis Brown came back and said, oh, I've just finally got around to reading this, and you've probably got an agent by now, but if not, let's talk. And I was like, no, I don't have one yet. She'd had a couple of manuscripts that she hadn't been able to sell. And because of that, she just thought the market was a bit tough at that point. And she said to me, would I get a structural edit done? And I said, I'd walk on the ceiling if you wanted me to at this stage, if it meant that I might get representation. And so, of course, I said yes. And she knew who she wanted to do the structural edit, and they weren't available for a while. So that wasn't until February of the following year that I finally got that done. So I felt like I had this really long, slow period at that point. But then once I got that structural edit done and I did the rewrite and I resubmitted it to her, she signed me up the next day. So all of a sudden, that was when everything started to sort of go at warp speed. And from there on, everything was very fast.
So you told us a little bit about the circumstances in which you started writing The Inheritance, but I wondered, when you started writing, had you thought that it would be something like this, like part family drama, part mystery, part crime? Like, where did the inspiration for this story come from?
Well, the inspiration came through the DNA test concept. So I was given a DNA test for Christmas, and I just started thinking about how often DNA tests must expose really long-held family secrets. But, people used to lie about all sorts of stuff in previous generations. That was how I came to the idea. And from there, there were so many different directions that we could possibly take the story, right? Like there was just, I spend all this time in these Facebook groups, and the Facebook groups are sort of represented in the novel. But there was one Facebook group in particular called DNA Detectives, and it's got about 250,000 members. So it's a lot of people. And basically it's where people go when they don't understand their DNA results. And so I started to spend a lot of time in there, and I became quite fascinated with what I was reading, because there's sort of two different groups of people who do DNA tests. The majority of people are just curious about their family, ethnicity or, their family history. But then there's this other group who are trying to solve a very specific mystery by doing it. So maybe they were adopted and they're trying to find birth parents, or they've never met their father, so they're trying to find him or something. And so the interesting thing is that often the group who are just curious are the answer to the mystery that the other bunch are trying to solve. And that's not what they're expecting when they do this bit of fun, find out a bit more about my family history sort of thing. So I kept seeing these posts that people would write in the Facebook groups, and they'd basically go along the lines of, oh, I just did this because I was curious, but I'm really confused by my results because my dad's name is nowhere and there's this other name that just keeps cropping up. And someone would very tactlessly in the comments say, your dad's not your dad. The DNA doesn't lie. This is what people would say all the time. And so it just got me thinking, like, wow, there's a lot of potential for this when it comes to fiction. And then I started thinking, I wonder if anyone's ever given a DNA test as a gift when they actually have an ulterior motive of wanting to expose a secret. And that's obviously the very first page of The Inheritance, is that Facebook post of someone saying that that's what they're planning to do. And of course, you don't know who it is as you read the book until almost the very last page, actually. And so I didn't actually know either, though. That was the funny thing. I mean, I'm a pantser. Well, in the first draft, I'm a pantser. So I had no idea who it was. And I had about 5 or 6 people who it could possibly be. And then when I worked it out, I was like, of course it is. That's the person who's done it. Yeah.
Yeah. I must say that was a lovely surprise.
It's like a little extra one right at the very end. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Okay. So we talked a little bit around the story. So I wondered, for the benefit of those who haven't yet read it, if you could tell us a little bit more about it.
The Inheritance is about 2 women and a dark secret that connects them. 29-year-old journalist Meg Hunter arrives in the exclusive town of Hartwell to investigate suspected corruption by Ashworth property. But she's also seeking answers to the mystery surrounding why her mother fled the town 30 years before, leaving them without any family at all. Meanwhile, 30-year-old heiress Isabel Ashworth is sent to Hartwell by her mogul father to rescue this controversial building development, but also to try and prove her commitment to the family business and therefore her place in the succession plan. When she's there and her path crosses with Meg's, the carefully guarded secrets of the past start to unravel with the help of the 3 DNA test kits, which mysteriously appear underneath the Ashworth family Christmas tree. As Isabel starts to question everything she knows about her family, she's drawn to Meg and her pursuit of the truth, but someone will stop at nothing to keep the secret hidden. And obviously all sorts of chaos ensues from there.
That's a wonderful summary of a terrific, terrific book. Now, Kate, as you said earlier, the DNA issue that you explore in this novel is a bit zeitgeisty. And I've read a number of stories now that touch on the issue of DNA testing, specifically how those tests can reveal long buried secrets held by families. And whilst I've never done one myself, I'm totally fascinated by them. And as you mentioned earlier, it was this thing that appeared in those Facebook threads that, DNA doesn't lie, but families do. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you wanted to explore this in the context of this novel?
I mean, I've always loved that show on SBS, Who Do You Think You Are? And one of the things that always amazes me every time I watch one, sometimes at the beginning I'll think, this one looks a bit boring, but then I'll keep watching and it's never boring. There's always something fascinating in that family's history. So I've always been interested in family dramas. Families fascinate me. I mean, I think there's sort of no boring family. And so that made me really interested in exploring that whole family thing. And so then when I had the idea about the DNA, it made me think that it was a really interesting way of exploring families and the dynamics of different families. And so then once I had the idea for this whole DNA thing, the next question was, well, who are the families involved? I definitely thought it was going to be more interesting and probably more fun if one of the families was very, very rich. I just figured it raises the stakes and it complicates, sibling relationships, and it creates a sort of, I think, a competitiveness that you don't necessarily see in other families. And so I liked the idea of having one very, very rich family. And then the other family is Meg and her mother. That's it. That's the family, because Meg's mother has refused to speak about whatever it was that happened in her past. So Meg knows that there was something, but her mother's always refused to talk about it. And then Meg's mother, Jenny, has early onset dementia. So at the start of the novel, Meg's really struggling with that because she's an only child with this mother with this terrible disease and young, she's sort of early 50s. But as the disease starts to progress, Jenny starts to reveal these clues to whatever it was that happened that she's refused to speak about. And that's where the book starts, really, with Meg kind of confused. Why is she talking about this place, Hartwell? Why is she mentioning this person called Tina? And it must have something to do with her past. And so when she does some Googling, she stumbles across the controversy in this, Ashworth building development that then leads her to the town. So she's kind of got two mysteries she's trying to solve. One is like, what's going on here with this building development? And the other is, did my mother live here? Do I have family here?
The story is punctuated by these Facebook threads, and in the book they're called the DNA sleuths, the people who are interested in DNA testing and who interact and ask for advice on the group. And as you've said, there are actually groups out there. Did you actually join one for the purposes of writing this book?
I did. I did. I joined the DNA detectives group, and there's a couple of them actually. There's an Australian kind of offshoot, so I was in that one as well. I don't even know how many hours I spent reading posts. One of the posts that for me was like a clincher that I thought, okay, I'm really onto something with this idea. I think this has definitely got potential. I will never forget this post because I thought, wow, this guy wrote, my dad wanted me and my siblings to do a DNA test because he's really, doing our family tree. And so we all did one. But now me and my siblings are sitting around looking at each other while our parents fight upstairs, and we're just looking at each other wondering which one of us isn't his. And I was like, oh, that's so good. And in fact, like, I spent so long in these groups and I read, there's so many different stories that people have or reasons why they are using DNA testing to try to work out who they are and who their families are. In fact, then I had to narrow it down because there were so many different directions I could have taken the story that then I had to go, well, hang on, okay, what's my story? What am I telling here? A lot of my understanding of DNA and how it works was through the resources in those Facebook groups, the centimorgans and how that actually works in terms of what your DNA result says and therefore how to understand the results, because the DNA results don't say to you, this person is your father or this person is your sister. It says you share this much of your DNA which is measured in centimorgans, with this person, which means that they're in this category of possible relationships. And so people then have to use what they know about themselves, their family, the ages. That people who are searching for somebody often are using social media, they're using birth records in order to work out who this person might be in relation to them.
Yeah, so this was a part of the story that utterly fascinated me because I'd never heard of centimorgans before. I've certainly seen things on MyHeritage, and it's, as you say, you know, there's the likelihood of this person falling into a particular category, but never heard it expressed in such a way. And I think certainly what happened in this story is that a result could lead to misunderstandings of what had actually happened. And so I think it's a bit of a cautionary tale in many ways, because whilst these DNA tests don't lie and they can be very instructive, they can also blow things up for people.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. The DNA doesn't lie, and it's a piece of evidence that tells you something, but your ability to interpret what it's telling you is also important as well. So in the book, I've kind of used those Facebook posts in order to educate the reader a little bit around some of that stuff that people won't know through the conversations that people are having in those Facebook groups. Certain things get explained, like about centimorgans, or, you know, about what possible relationships somebody might be to you.
You talked a little bit about the fact that Meg's mum, Jenny, is suffering from early onset dementia, as she's in an aged care facility. And at a couple of points in the novel, she actually displays some violent behaviour, which is not unusual for dementia patients. I wondered, though, Kate, if you could tell me why exploring dementia was important to this novel.
From a plotting perspective, I needed to have some reason why she might start revealing things about the past. So it does play a role from a plot perspective, but I also just think that the rates of dementia are just so high. I mean, I think it's the highest. I heard some statistic recently, like it's the leading cause of death, I think, for women in Australia. And so it's something that a lot of people are experiencing. But yeah, it was quite fundamental to the plot, because I needed, for this story to work, I needed to have somebody, a character, which was Meg, who just has this empty space where a story should be about herself and her family. At the beginning of the book, she's just in such a vacuum. She's got a mother. She doesn't know anything else about herself, her identity, who her father is. She has no siblings. She has no cousins. She has nothing. And they've just moved from one town to another, her whole upbringing. So she knows that there is something that has happened in her mother's past, but she doesn't know what it is, and her mum won't speak about it. So, you know, the dementia made sense of that. And it also then made sense of how those cracks are starting to appear in that carefully sort of guarded secret.
Another particular point in the novel where dementia is explained to Meg by her mother's neurologist. And I thought this was especially instructive. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this actually came from the memoir of Wendy Mitchell, who died only a year or so ago. And she was an advocate for dementia sufferers, but she herself was suffering from dementia. And she wrote this book called Somebody I Used to Know. It's an amazing book because it's written by somebody who has the disease. I am quite indebted to her for my representation of Jenny, because I borrowed a few things from her book. One was that analogy that the doctor uses, which when I read that, I had never heard dementia explained in that way. So basically, for listeners who haven't read the book, the neurologist uses an analogy of a bookshelf. And she says, if your memories are stored on a bookshelf and you fill them up from the bottom shelves first, the memories at the top are the most recent ones. But then if if dementia starts to shake the bookshelf, and those memories at the top, the top shelves are going to fall first, which means that you've lost your most recent memories, but the memories on the shelves further down now feel like your most recent memories. So that explains why people will often mistake somebody for their mother, or, so people will often get confused in a generational sense between people. The other thing that I was inspired by Wendy Mitchell's book in was the description of Jenny's Post-it notes on the kitchen cupboards and drawers, because she was forgetting where things were. And so it was like, one of the things that Wendy Mitchell was extraordinary at was devising systems so that she could manage her disease really, really effectively for quite a long time. And that was one of the systems that she had, was that she sort of had notes everywhere on things. And so I got such a visual of what that must look like in a house when I read that. And I thought, that was quite inspiring. So Meg comments that it wasn't until she went into her mother's house and saw this that she realised how far progressed the disease was.
I thought you dealt with this incredibly well and sensitively, and really did give readers an insight into what it must be like.
Oh, thank you. Because actually in my structural edit, one of the things that my editor said was, I think you need to do better at the way that you've represented. She said, readers get very upset if they think you're just using something as a sort of plot point, a convenient device in a story. And so she said, I think you need to go deeper and give us a bit more. I was sort of maybe just not going as deeply into the disease or the diagnosis. And so I wrote more around a lot of that.
Now, you spoke a little bit about Isabel, or Izzy as we know her in the book. You didn't spare Izzy in those opening chapters. I mean, she's cloaked in wealth and entitlement, using her family name as an all-access pass through all areas of her life. And she's what we over here in the East call an Eastern Suburbs princess, or a socialite,
absolutely,
for want of a better word. But when she gets to Hartwell, she gets a bit of a rude shock, doesn't she?
She does, yeah. I think she's been so, how sometimes you can't see things clearly because you're in it. And so at the start of the story, when we meet her, she's a product of being, the only daughter of this very, very wealthy, prestigious family. And so she has no idea how out of touch she is, how entitled she is, how much privilege she has. She just has no clue. And it's not until she gets to Hartwell and she has this kind of mirror held up to her, because the locals, turns out, hate her and hate the Ashworths and have a whole bunch of resentments towards this family. And so it's not until she gets there that she has any experiences which challenge that self-perception that she's grown up with. And so she has quite a journey that she sort of goes on. She ends up somewhere pretty different from where she starts, I think.
And speaking about that, I think, despite that superficiality, that sort of cloak of entitlement that we see her wrapped in at the beginning, I think she's genuinely determined to prove her worth to the family business, which is why she accepts the challenge and decides to go down to Hartwell. But I feel that the cards were not exactly stacked in her favor. I think, she's as you said, she's the youngest child of a very wealthy family, and there's a very large gap between her and her older siblings. So it was really quite hard for her to be taken seriously in many ways. And to add insult to injury, the Ashworth Property Group was very much engaged in a jobs for the boys culture. Don't you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you look at her parents, they've got very traditional roles in their own approach, to their life and their family and their work. Heather is very much the matriarch who doesn't work, who is pretty and, perfectly groomed and all of that. And there is this expectation, I think, that everybody has, that Izzy will just be like Heather, but she doesn't want to. I really love Izzy as a character, and I think she's pretty smart, and she is quite hardworking, and she doesn't actually shy away from a challenge once, push comes to shove. She is made of something a bit tougher, I think, than anybody realized. And it would be possible to just, choose a sort of easier route, but she doesn't want to. And so I sort of sympathize with her a bit. I know it's sort of like poor little rich girl, but, she sort of isn't taken seriously, and it's pretty shallow and superficial, this world that she inhabits. And I think she senses that. At the beginning of the story, I don't think she's consciously aware of how she feels about that. But certainly throughout the story, I think she does become increasingly aware of how superficial the world is that she's been inhabiting, and that she doesn't want to do that anymore.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, Kate, was like, given your work in the corporate sector, do you think Izzy's experiences are isolated?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think Izzy's are exaggerated probably compared to most people's experience, but I definitely still think that there's a jobs for the boys culture in a lot of organizations. I mean, particularly in this case, because it's property development. I mean, I think if you go into a lot of those businesses, I think you'd find that it's a pretty blokey place, and, that it might be hard for women to get taken seriously. I'm sure that's changed a bit, but I don't know. My suspicions are that it probably hasn't changed as much as maybe we hope it would. And even in banking, I do a lot of work with banking and finance, and you see it. You absolutely see it there.
I want to talk about Meg. You said it a little bit earlier. She's having a tough time with her mum, Jenny, and not only because of the dementia, but largely due to the fact that Jenny never really shared any information about Meg's father or their extended family. And she feels that rise up again between them when the dementia sends Jenny back into parts of her past that confuse Meg even more, and then obviously sends her on this journey. So even without the dementia, I think Meg feels as if she struggled to really know her mother. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
I think this book really, like, one way of thinking about this story is that it is a story about mothers and daughters. Like, there's the Heather Isabel relationship, and then there's the Jenny Meg relationship. And I do find it interesting because I think to some extent we don't know our mothers. Like, when we're growing up, we just know them as our mother. And I do think that as you grow up, there's this point where you suddenly realize that they're a person with a whole bunch of, stuff that has nothing to do with you. And in fact, a lot of their life was lived before you existed. We do adjust as we grow up to realize and properly see our mothers as they are, rather than, just as our mother. And I think both of them do that in this story. Both of them, their understanding of their mother and who their mother is changes hugely by the end of the book, for better or worse, depending on which character we're talking about. Yeah, I do think that's interesting. And interestingly, my second book, there's a mother-daughter theme again. So I must be very interested in this theme.
Okay, political corruption.
Yeah.
Especially when it results in wealth generation and sweetheart property deals that bend all the rules. That's something that I'm super interested in, and I've explored in a variety of ways in my own writing. Why was this something you were drawn to?
Oh, I think I just see a lot of just the rich getting richer and decisions that are made so that the big pile of money that people have just gets bigger and bigger. And I guess I'm pretty cynical about the motivations of big companies to some extent. And I mean, not all of them, but yeah, I do find corruption interesting. I mean, there's a building development, I won't say where, but we have a little holiday place up the coast. And whenever we go there, I look at this one development and I'm like, what went on here? There must be a story, because it is just madness that this thing was built where it was built, and so many houses and so little infrastructure. And there's so many things about it that just don't make sense. And it makes you think somebody's pockets, wallet got fatter as a result of that approval being done. So that was something that seemed interesting to me. I mean, I needed a project for both of them. I needed Izzy to have something that she was trying to achieve. And, that turns out in the book, it's the Hartwell jail development. And I needed Meg to have something that she was trying to achieve, which is exposing corruption in this development, which obviously creates good conflict between the two of them. But when I was trying to work out what that was, and I thought, I've got, a few different ideas, I was just Googling and reading articles about, places down south on the Southern Highlands. And I stumbled across an article about Berrima Jail. And so Hartwell Jail is loosely inspired by some controversy that went on at some stage about Berrima Jail being redeveloped. And I didn't even read much more about that, to be honest. It was just enough that it made me go, aha, I know what the thing is now.
My next question was there a particular reason you set it in the Southern Highlands? I mean, yeah, it's one thing to loosely base it on Berrima Jail, but then you've set Hartwell in the Southern Highlands itself. Do you think it could have worked anywhere as well as it did there?
Probably. I think one of the reasons why I liked setting it there was because there are some very, very wealthy towns down there. And so it made sense that this Ashworth family would kind of have this bit of a stronghold on this town, because generations have lived there. And so it made sense. It just, at a purely practical level, it was good that it was so close to Sydney, because I obviously have both characters starting in Sydney and then both arriving in this small town, which is kind of an hour and a half down the freeway. So that was another reason. So I think just the geographic proximity was necessary. Yeah. But I mean, I've always liked the Southern Highlands, and I do think some of those towns are quite interesting, because you do get wealthy Sydney families owning property down there, but then you've got locals who live there, and there's an interesting tension, I think, between those two groups of people. And that's certainly, again, something that tension underpins the novel to some extent.
Yes, indeed it does. Kate, if you could sum up your book in a couple of sentences, how would you do that?
Oh, a couple of sentences. Well, when people say to me, what's it about? I always say it's about what happens when 3 DNA test kits mysteriously appear under the Christmas tree of one of Australia's wealthiest families, addressed to the 3 adult siblings, and no one knows who put them there or why. In terms of It's been interesting at the endorsements that I've had from authors, and I find their comparisons really interesting and some of them surprising. So there's been a very strong comparison to Succession, obviously, because a lot of people have watched Succession, and there's the two brothers and the sister, and so there is that, and that very, very strong, quite ruthless patriarch of the family. And so there's definitely some parallels there. But I also think there are some parallels in a funny way to something like Schitt's Creek as well, because, you've got this wealthy family and in this town where there's lots of different, locals, and not everyone necessarily likes them. And I do think that the Ashworth family is somewhere in that mix of, the Roses from Schitt's Creek. And I do like that kind of rich people behaving badly genre. Yeah, some of the comparisons have been interesting.
So you've been a published author for probably 6 weeks or so, maybe a little bit longer now. What's the best thing about being a published author?
The best thing about it for me was putting me out of my waiting impatience, because even though I didn't have to wait very long, it still is a funny period between signing your book deal and your first book coming out, because it's like that waiting place. In the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, and it talks about the waiting place. I very much felt like I was in the waiting place for that 6 months, because I knew that this big exciting thing was going to happen in January when my book came out, but nothing had happened yet. And so I was kind of just anticipating, how that would all go. And so it was great when it came out. Because it came out on New Year's Day, it was quite good, because all my events where I'm talking about the book were held back a bit because so many people are away in January. So I could just sort of see it out there and people posting photos of it at airports and wherever. And I could sort of focus on that. And I was getting some great feedback from people who'd read it as well. And then now I'm in this sort of events phase. I've had a couple of events and I'm doing lots of podcasts, and I've got, I think I've got 3 more events over the next couple of weeks. So the thing that's amazing me is that these imaginary friends of mine are now known by other people, not just me. I love that. Like, I love the things that people have said about what they felt about different characters. And I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. And even the little things that people find funny in the book, I've loved hearing that. I'm like, oh, good, because I had a little giggle when I wrote that myself with my tongue in my cheek. And so it's nice when you get that sort of feedback.
I've noticed that you're part of the #Debut Crew 2025, as a lot of debut authors are this year. Can you tell me a little bit about that, its genesis and its importance to you as a debut author this year?
So the Debut Crew, I think the first one might have been in 2023, and I'm not sure who it was that started that one, but they sort of just collected up when they saw someone, saying, oh, I just got a book deal, my book's coming out next year or whatever. They started just collecting up, and I think it was a WhatsApp group or a Facebook group or something back then. And so it then caught on. And so Lisa Kenway started the 2024 one, and she, was sort of the head of that one. And then Madeline Cleary started the 2025 one. And it's been fantastic, because there are a lot of funny little questions that you've got, and publishing is it is an interesting industry, and they don't really give you like a booklet that says, these are the FAQs about everything that's going to happen between now and then. You do kind of work it all out as you go a little bit and get drip fed information. And so it's been fantastic to have this group of people, and and it's people who've written children's books or young adult or fantasy or everything, non-fiction, but everybody's in the same boat in that we're all having our first book traditionally published this year. So it's been fantastic. It's like there's sort of nowhere else I could ask quite as many stupid questions, I think, without feeling embarrassed. And it's been great as well, because Holly Broombauer has been posting, the books coming out each month. And so that's good. And so it's sort of just helping to publicize all of these new books that are coming out too.
Anything that gets the Australian reading public supporting more Australian authors is terrific in my book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. It's just amazing how many great books are coming out, by Australian writers. It's really like such a strong current group, I think, of authors. And I mean, the writing community outside of just the Debut Crew is amazing, but the writing community in general is just so warm and supportive and welcoming. I think for someone who's new, it's like, come along to this, come to that. Like, everyone is really lovely. So that's been a lovely sort of side of it as well.
So, Kate, for anyone out there who might be listening, what's your best advice for someone who might be in the position you were in not so long ago?
I think one is to get connected to the writing community. I think that makes everything better and easier and also more fun. Often I think when people start writing, they, it can be a bit of a lonely thing. Like you're sitting in front of your computer by yourself a lot of the time. But there's this brilliant community and there's so many events that are always on. And so using social media, I mean, there's a lot that's wrong with social media, but there's a lot that's brilliant about it as well. I've made so many good friends through Instagram, basically. And so going to events, and it does feel a bit weird. I mean, I actually, like looking back, I started writing my first manuscript in 2019 and I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anything. I just thought I'll have a go at writing a book and see what happens. I think I bought a couple of craft books and thought, okay, let's have a crack at this. And when I had about half or maybe 3/4 of a first draft, I went down to an event that was at Manly Art Gallery and Joe Nell, Cassie Hamer and Penelope Janu were speaking on this panel. And I thought, and I knew Cassie from school. And so I thought, I'm just going to turn up to this thing. And it feels so awkward. Like it really does. You feel very self-conscious and a bit silly and a bit like an imposter. But, that's how you meet people and you have good conversations with people. And then that starts to create this network, and back then I didn't know Cassie very well. And now she's quoted on the front of my book. So I think it is really important to get connected to the people who are writing, and also they understand what you're doing. And it is a tricky thing. Normal people don't really understand how hard it is to write a book, I think, or just some of the unique challenges that it throws up. But the other piece of advice I would have is to invest in learning the craft of writing. At first, I did some little, really short courses, and then I bit the bullet and I did the Faber Writing a Novel course. There's lots of similar courses, but I think you've got to learn the craft. There is an art to writing, but there is a craft, and there's technical aspects of writing that you don't know and you have to learn. So I would say to invest in yourself and your writing skills, because you will be a better writer and you'll be a faster writer too. You'll write more easily and you'll understand how to make something work rather than going, oh, I don't get why this isn't quite working. There's often a technical reason why it might not be working. So that would be my tip. Get connected, get out there and meet people, and invest in learning the craft.
Yeah, fantastic advice. Thank you so much. And oddly, I was at that event.
Were you?
Yes.
It was the first book event I went to.
You told us about a second book that you have written and now submitted. Is there anything you can tell us about the story?
Yeah, I won't say too much about it. I haven't perfected my pitch for this one. I need to start working on this. It's set in a quite remote coastal town, and it surrounds the mysterious disappearance and death of the main character's best friend when they were teenagers. So she returns to the town years later, 16 years later, after her best friend died in really mysterious circumstances, and she was the last person to see her alive, or the last known person to see her alive. And so she ended up leaving the town a few years later, surrounded by rumor and suspicion. And when her father dies, she has to return. And when she does, she discovers some things that are going on in the present day, like 16 years later, that revive her suspicions about the role that her friend's boyfriend might have played in her death. And so she decides to find out. So it's similar. It's a mystery. It's probably more crimey, like more sort of pure crime than The Inheritance is, which is a bit of a fusion. It's sort of, my publisher described it as crime adjacent, The Inheritance, whereas this one's probably just crime. Yeah, and so that's the next book. And I've just had word just earlier today that it's ready for structural edit. So that's very good news.
That is great news. Fantastic indeed. Kate, I have been so impressed by The Inheritance, which is such a satisfying story and touches on so many aspects of contemporary Australian life. I wish you every success with it and the novels that will no doubt follow. Thank you very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me. I've loved our chat. Thank you. And thank you to the listeners for listening as well.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.